Hello everyone and welcome to the Aujourd'hui Psychology podcast, the podcast where travel meets psychology. My name is Pamela and you guessed it, I'm a psychologist with a passion for travel. In Aujourd'hui Psychology, we meet travelers and psychologists who share their adventure stories through concepts of psychology.
Religion has been part of our societies for centuries. In psychology, it is defined as the co-presence of beliefs, ritualized experiences, norms, and groups that refer to what people perceive to be transcendent to human entity. While there are many religions, there are also many ways of expressing religion. So you do not need to go very far in order to meet people who live their religion in a completely different way from yours, even if you both belong to the same denomination. Alternatively, you can also meet people from a completely different religion, but who will live it in a similar way to yours. This is because we all have our own religiousness. Religiousness refers to the individual differences in being interested or involved with religion. Here, we are interested in attitudes, cognitions, emotions, and behaviors. This means that although there are some tendencies within religions, we all have our own ways of expressing our religiosity, our spirituality, and even our non-religiosity. So while we may not all be religious, we can all be spiritual somehow. In fact, spirituality has been defined as a sense of connection to something higher than ourselves. Spirituality is about seeking and expressing meaning. It is about people's experience of the connectedness to the moment, to self, to others, to nature, and to the significant or the sacred. Today's episode is the second part of my conversation with Elias. Elias is from North Carolina and decided to travel to South Korea to do a language course at just 18 years old. Then, after a few months, he went back there to visit his host family and also lived in a Buddhist temple. In the second part, Elias tells us about his life at the temple, his relationship with Christianity while growing up, and his learning of Buddhism. I hope that you enjoyed this episode and that Elias' story will bring a bit of gentleness and love in your day. And if you haven't listened to the first part of this conversation, go check out episode 7. So, are you guys ready? Let's hit the road.
And so, can you just tell us a bit about the temple itself?
So the temple, we were at Temple Gochunam, which is part of a larger group network of temples, and the larger temple's name is Palmsa. So I volunteered there for 1 month, and most Korean Buddhism is under the Mahayana branch of Buddhism, but this temple specifically was part of Daehanbulkyo Jogyechong, which is a specific kind of sect of Buddhism in Korea. And the temple was established in 554 CE. So we were at the upper temple. It was a little bit further up the mountainside, whereas the larger temple was a little bit lower. And it was kind of situated alongside this river that was kind of flowing down from the mountain. It's all surrounded by this forest. It's not quite a jungle, but it kind of has this jungle-like feeling with all of the bamboo and different birds singing, and you can hear the frogs at night, and it's really, really wonderful. There's like wild tea trees that's where we harvested the tea from. It was absolutely wonderful.
It sounds quite peaceful, actually. And is it quite big? Because the way you describe it, it seems rather big.
I know it is one of the larger temples in Korea. It's not large in the same sense that some of the urban temples are, but it does have like a monastic school, It has several, I think it may have 3 or 4 smaller temples on top of the large temple. So it's quite an expansive network. And there's lots of tourists that come. There's lots of people making religious pilgrimages there. I know a museum there, kind of focused on the archaeological and artistic side of the temple because it is so old. So it is a pretty big and important cultural center for Korea, especially for Buddhists. Most Buddhists would know Hwangsa because it's so big and important and famous. But if you're not Buddhist, you may not have heard of it.
Mm-hmm. It must have been quite a big difference coming from the big city life to the temple life.
Yes, it definitely was a side of Korea that I had not seen before, which I really appreciated because I had, been to urban temples in Seoul, and, they were beautiful and very peaceful, and, they had gardens and trees and, the traditional architecture and things like that. But to truly be situated in the middle of nowhere in the mountains, it gave it an entirely different feeling. And it was a very spiritual setting, and it was a place where you really felt connected and grounded to the living things around you.
And so you said you stayed there for a month, right?
Yes.
What did you do over there? What was a typical day like?
So we did several things as volunteers there, most of which was tea making. I was there towards the end of the tea season, so that entailed everything from harvesting tea to kind of drying it, roasting it, rolling it, fermenting it, and all the way to packaging it. So there was that whole process that we learned of how to make the tea. And there was also a week that we spent harvesting plums. But I would also help with pretty much anything around the temple that needed to be done. A lot of general maintenance. I would, help chop firewood for the ondul, which is the traditional heating system, or I would help set up altars and with fruit offerings and make sure everything was clean, helping in the kitchen, whatever needed to be done. I was always there to help in whatever way I could. So generally, the kind of everyday ritual or habits, we would wake up around 6 and we would all eat breakfast together. We would have maybe an hour to shower, get dressed, meditate, whatever we please. And then we would have a little bit of tea together before starting work. We would work on whatever the task of the day was. That could be firewood, that could be packing tea, that could be roasting tea, whatever needed to get done. And then we would work until about 11 o'clock, and we would all have lunch together, and then we would have probably an hour or 2 of free time. So usually I would walk down to the river, write in my journal for a little bit, or I would, while Cami was there, we would always walk down to the larger temple, and we went to a cafe there and would get tea or coffee. And then we would start work again, and then we would end around 5 o'clock, and then we'd have dinner together, the whole temple eating together. And then until evening, into the evening, it was just free time to meditate, write. Sometimes we would go out into the village in the valley. But most of the time we would stay around the temple, enjoy evening tea, go on walks. I would oftentimes find time to pray in the evening. But it was and then there was no structured time to go to bed, but you do know you had to be up at 6 in the morning.
Yeah.
So generally I'd go to bed around 9 or 10 o'clock.
Okay, so that's quite a big day in a way.
Yes.
And you said there were tourists as well. Did you have to do anything with the tourists at all, or were they just visiting on their own? How did that go?
For the Korean tourists, a lot of them were making more religious pilgrimages, or they were visiting family or something to that effect. And most of the time with them, I would just, politely bow and welcome them. And, if there was someone, if there were going to be a large amount of tourists coming, I would always, help make sure that the yard was clean, that we pulled weeds, that we had dusted the altar off and put fresh offerings up or something. But most of the time with the Korean tourists, I would politely say hello and, introduce myself or something, because it was for quite a few people surprising that I spoke Korean as well as I did. And so I would generally greet the people that were having tea or what have you. But with foreign tourists, I was generally, I would accompany them a lot more. And I would if they had questions for the monks, I could kind of translate for the two of them. So there was an American soldier that was doing a temple stay at the lower temple. And I spent the evening with him one time answering some of his questions and guiding him around as he didn't speak any Korean, just to help him kind of get a better sense of the traditions and the culture that he was experiencing.
Okay. Yeah, that seems interesting as well. It's another part of it, and being able to just share what you experience yourself in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And what about with the residents? What was your relationship like with them?
So there were lots of people that were coming and going. There were volunteers. Of course, I was only there for a month. So, I saw some people that had been there for 2 months, and then they left after I had been there for a week. And then other people would come, and then other people would go. So there was a lot of people coming in and out. So there was the volunteers who I would be working with all day. And a lot of us would just, while we're working, we're mostly working with our hands. So we could talk about anything that we wanted to, where we're from, how we, found out about the temple, lots of discussing the tea and the healing nature of the tea or the technique in which we would be making it. And then there was lots of people that were also there for, that would stay in the same boarding house as the volunteers, but they were just there to kind of heal their body, heal their soul. A lot of them had, worked really hard, or they had some sort of sickness that was just persisting. And so they were there for personal spiritual healing. And then also with some of the monks doing some more traditional Eastern healing with yoga and more herbal medicine and things like that. And then there was also people that would often make religious pilgrimages. And most of the time I would just let them kind of do their thing and wouldn't speak to them much, just so that they could focus on their prayers and whatever they had,
mm-hmm.
with their own kind of spirituality. And then there were the monks. At Gochungam, there were 2 monks that were interacting with the volunteers and everyone the most. So I was pretty close with the 2 of them, but the rest of the monks were, they were more isolated, and they were mostly focused on their studies and their meditation. And so I would have meals with them, but they were silent the entire time. And some of them would, speak to me and be like, oh, where are you from? And, oh, what have you learned in your time here? And things like that. It would always be a very brief but pleasant conversation, but I wasn't terribly close to any of them because they were mostly focused on their practice and they weren't involved in the tea making or anything. But one monk in particular I was very close with, and we would have tea together often, and I would ask questions about Buddhism, and he would give me scripture to read or try and help me find, because the vocabulary was so difficult, he's like, well, if you want, I can, maybe this would have some English versions or something. So he was very gracious with his time, always entertained my curiosities. And for that, I'm very thankful.
And I feel like it's quite nice for you as well to be able to learn about it.
Yeah.
And speaking of religion, I know that religion is also a big part of the culture in the US. Was it important to you when you were growing up?
For me, I felt kind of distanced from Christianity, which especially in the American South is very much the dominant culture, the dominant religion, which interacts heavily with the mainstream culture of the South, because I have a more queer identity, part of the LGBTQ community. I felt kind of distance from that. But despite that, oftentimes my classmates at school or my places of work, all of the people that I was interacting with in my community had still, held the values of Christianity to a high regard. And so it was something that I was confirmed in the church. So I definitely did study the Bible for 3 years, every single Sunday, and things like that, where I do have a good understanding of Christianity, but personally I find it difficult to relate to, particularly for the reason of the church being not as welcoming to queer people.
Yep. Yeah, I understand. And then do you think that relationship that you had with religion in the US, so I feel like you had a pretty open-minded relationship, you learned about it and you took interest, but you just don't relate much to it. Do you think that this view that you had on Christianity impact your stay at the temple?
I think there was so much about me coming to the temple that they could have, questioned perhaps. I'm white, I'm American, I grew up Christian, and I feel like if I was Asian and, Korean and grew up Buddhist and I went to a church, I wouldn't get the same reaction that I did as, doing the opposite. I feel like churches are very exclusive at times, and the temple welcomed me with open arms. They weren't asking questions. They weren't interrogating me about my personal life and how sinful I was or anything like that, which made it a lot easier to kind of express my curiosity without feeling as though I was going to be converted or anything like that. Because I feel like that's a very, especially among evangelical Christians, it's very much about promoting your religion, whereas the Buddhist tradition is much more just, we're here and you can always be part of this if you choose that, but they never asked us to participate in prayers or do any religious practice that we didn't want to do. They always offered. They were always like, do you want to come along? But it was not like, oh, you should come along. This is so important. So I think that difference in their attitude and their approach made a really big difference in how I was able to slowly come to understand it. And I had to kind of unlearn a lot of my mindsets about religion that I had learned from Christianity, even though I may not have taken Christianity as personally as I thought. But, I don't call myself a devout Christian, but at the same time, I had kind of implicitly internalized a lot of Christian views. There's this very distinct idea of sin in Christianity, and I kind of wanted to know what Buddhist sin looked like. And it wasn't, sin isn't something that they're greatly focused on. That's not, the core part of their theology. So I kind of had to learn that not everything's going to have a direct translation and any of that. I had to just have a whole new open mind, and I had to open my mind in ways that I thought, I was like, oh, I'm super open-minded. I'll learn about this and it won't be a big deal. But no, I had to still do a lot of self-reflection in order to make myself more open to learning.
So did it come to you as quite a shock then, this the whole differences that you've noticed between the two approach to religion?
I think that they were so gentle and patient and kind about it that it was never shocking. It was just kind of, I would have these moments where I was almost shocked with myself. It wasn't shocked about Buddhism or the temple or the community and culture that I was around. It was kind of shock with the way that I had grown up, kind of shock of the way that I feel like a lot of my American upbringing had been not just my family, you know, it's not like my family raised me to be selfish, but I think that American culture can be very selfish. And just kind of realizing that I had all these habits that were so selfish. I mean, there's just a lot of things that I had never questioned before. And then all of a sudden I had these like shocking revelations that, oh wow, I had never questioned myself before. I had never applied any critical thinking to this before. And it wasn't like anyone at the temple was saying, oh, you should question this. But they just had this way of exposing me to things that would initiate a thought process. And they would let me to come to whatever conclusion I came to on my own. And it was just very, very healing. And I find myself a better person because of it.
I feel like the way of doing things, the way you explain it, it's more pointing out the dissonance, maybe. But you are the one who is doing the journey. And like you said, they're there to, not to guide you, but to welcome your questionings. Whereas your experience of Christianity was more where they were actively guiding you and they were actively telling you what to question. Whereas your experience at the temple was more pointing out things. And then you do, was that what you want? You can go on the journey of questioning it, or you can't if you don't want to.
Absolutely.
And so was it difficult for you to come face to face with those things, to realize, you know, you talked a lot about selfishness or your own bias in your upbringing. Was it difficult for you to come face to face with that?
I think at times it was really, I would say sadness was the greatest emotion that really that elicited out of me, was because like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is a hugely important figure in America, and he spoke of what he calls like the beloved community. It's this community, kind of the ideal community where people care deeply about each other and, you know, protect each other and are there for each other. And everyone kind of sees the other as their brother, their sister, and treats their community like their family. And that's always something that I, you know, valued and respected growing up. But to see that being applied in a way that I had never seen before in Korea in this temple, where everyone was kind of had a common purpose, had some like connection to each other, and really was just everyone worked and played and ate and lived in this very like harmonious, dynamic way where it wasn't, you know, free of conflict. It wasn't like you were isolated from the harsh realities of the world. I mean, there were sick people. There were people that were, you know, dealing with grief and trauma, but to be in such a healing space and to see myself in a way where I was so willing to give so much to other people in a way that I had never been before. I was able to get into this mindset of being so generous and so kind in a way that I was never, I feel like Americans are encouraged to be quite cold towards each other and stingy with each other, and to have all of that kind of dissolve away so quickly and come to an entirely different way of seeing a community, it was spectacular.
And so how would you say that this entire experience changed you then?
I would say that there was this sense of, I can't remember who says the quote, but it's like when you learn a second language or when you speak a second language, you have a second soul. And I think this kind of sense of the duality in my life of like, oh, like I have my family in the US and I have my family in Korea. I have my home in the US. I have my home in Korea. I have my spirituality in the US and my set of values and culture in the US. And then also that kind of mirror image in Korea. It helps me reckon with kind of the flaws of home, but also how to come to peace with them and how to kind of take the best of both. Because there are some like deeply Confucian values about like gender that I think are that Korea still enforces and still holds very true, which I don't, agree with or see eye to eye with. This idea that like women are subservient to men, I do not subscribe to that. I don't appreciate that. I don't think that's a good way to view gender. But at the same time, learning from Korea in the way that, being more selfless, giving yourself to your community, and how fulfilling that can be personally, but how big of an impact that can make for other people around you. So all of those things really changed me deeply.
I feel like it's made you reconnect in a way with yourself and with values as well.
Yes, absolutely.
And then, so if you could relive a single day in your experience, which one would it be if you can choose one?
There are several days I can call back on, but I think it was the day that Jonghyun and Kemi were at the temple, because it was my last few days at the temple. And I knew that Jonghyun was coming to visit me because he lived in Seoul and we were good friends. But Kemi surprised me. I was picking plums and I was, carrying this crate around, and all of a sudden she like came around the corner and surprised me, and I was so happy to see her because I wasn't expecting to see her at all, and it had been a few weeks since I had seen her. I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to see her again before I left Korea, and it would just made me so happy to see her again. And Jonghyun came, and the three of us spent the whole day together just working, but we also we jumped into the river and swam in the river. We had coffee together. We were just, all three of us kind of mixing our three languages all together, spending time together. And that's when I had spent the most time with the monks. I had the other volunteers, the people that lived in the village. And so I just saw so many people throughout that day that I had spent the last month getting closer and closer to. But it was just so special. And we just had good food and worked hard, had fun doing it. And it was the most beautiful blue skies, perfect weather. I had just never felt more loved and close to everyone. There's no words to describe how that day felt.
Isn't it amazing how no matter where we are or what we really do, it's the people, the love, like you said.
It's always the people.
No, I really have to agree with that. And so, what are your plans for the near future then? Do you intend on going back to Korea, or any other plans that you're working on at the moment?
Right now, I've finally been able to start college in person because my university was entirely online for the past year because of COVID. So right now, I'm kind of turning my focus towards my studies. I'm going to be a Korean language and literature major, applying for undergraduate research assistant positions, but I'm hoping that perhaps during this upcoming summer, depending on the circumstances of the pandemic, I would be able to go back and volunteer again, but hopefully work with perhaps an internship or something to that effect, where I would be assisting in helping foreign tourists do temple stays or other translation work. But I'm sure that I will be back soon to visit my family and to visit the temple.
Yeah, I feel like it has a special place in your heart now, doesn't it?
Most certainly.
And then I think we're coming up to my last question. And it's a bit interesting to ask you this question after we've talked about individualistic and collectivistic values. But I wanted to know, what makes you special.
What makes me special? I feel like I have a very unique set of circumstances coming from this very small town that's very, very white, very, it's suburban, surrounded by mostly very, very rural, traditional South, to going to this, no one in my family necessarily expected me to spend time in South Korea and come to these kind of cultural understanding and language proficiency that I have, and having that intersect with my identity as a queer person, as with all these interesting, different, unique dynamics. But I think it's also, I feel very lucky to be able to communicate in the ways that I am, in the languages that I do know, where I hope that I can always communicate with sincerity and make the people around me feel loved and appreciated in the way that I do feel about them. So I hope that that's what makes me special. I hope that's what stands out to people about me, is that I hope to be as sincere as possible in, expressing my gratitude and expressing my thankfulness for who they are as a person and who they are as a member of the community.
We go back to love and people, don't we?
Yeah.
I feel like it's something that's very present in your life.
Love. Yeah. Most of the time, it's just like, it always comes back to how much I love other people.
Well, isn't it? I love it. I love it. All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this with me. I really, really, I'm very thankful for having you. Thank you.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for having this wonderful platform, always hosting these wonderful discussions. I'm sure it's going to bring joy to so many people.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Roadie Psychology. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked the episode, please give me little stars on your favorite listening platform and subscribe to be the first to listen to the next ones. You can also follow me on Instagram @Roadie Psychology and invite your friends to join us on this journey through psychology. If you have any comments, questions, or if you feel like participating in the podcast, feel free to send me a little message. See you soon for another journey.